Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Borderlands 3 video. My name is Nootmad, and today I'll be taking you guys through some important pieces of information that I think every Moze player should know about. So in the last episode, we covered some pieces of information that I thought a lot of players would find important. And in this episode, I'm going to cover some of the class mods in detail, with some future videos covering the rest of them. I'm only going to cover a few class mods in this episode, just in the interest of making sure I can cover each class mod in enough detail, and I don't want this video to be ridiculously long, so I thought it would be best if I just break it up, do a couple class mods for each episode, just so I can keep everything as concise, but also making sure there's enough detail in my descriptions of each class mod for you guys to understand them completely and how they work. So yeah, I hope you guys find this video useful. I've had a lot of positive feedback about the previous videos, and I just want to thank you guys so much for all the support you've been giving me. It means a lot. But yeah, let's get straight into the video. Okay, so for the first section of this video, we're going to be covering the Bloodless class mod. So for this class mod and the following ones, I'm not going to rank them or anything like that. I'm not going to give them a tier, just to avoid bias. Instead, what I'm going to do is just discuss their strengths and weaknesses, and how they would apply to Moze builds in the current meta. So anyway, the Bloodless class mod has been in and out of the Moze meta since release. The special effect is to essentially just turn any and all health regen into shield regen, and this has allowed players to sustain really high shield capacity, and as long as that's coupled with substantial amounts of health regen, your shield is practically infinite. So this essentially brings us to Bloodless' first selling point, and that's its ability to exploit shield mechanics. What I mean by that is that it enables shields such as the rerouter and the stopgap to be used incredibly effectively, as they are based on the amount of shield and the percentage of shield that is active, essentially. So if you had played Moze on release, Hex Grenade spam was used a lot in conjunction with the skill Vampire, which gave Moze health regeneration based on the amount of instances of splash damage it did with a grenade, and that basically just gave her a lot of health regen. So combine that with a Bloodless and a rerouter shield, that essentially enabled Moze to just constantly upkeep and amp on every single shot she did, and that made guns like the Flacker, who does a lot of high base damage and fires pretty slowly, and it worked incredibly well with the rerouter shield. However, since then, a delay had been added to the shield recharge, and people thought that you couldn't be able to do that anymore. However, that's still the case. And even nowadays, you can use a Bloodless class mod, you can use a grenade like the Hex, or the Cloning Maddening Tracker, and an amp shield like the One-Shotter, that can boost your amp damage and give you an amp on every shot with, once again, high damage, slow firing weapons like the Plague Barrel. And so what this combination does is just enables Moze to use substantial amounts of amp damage to deal large amounts of damage to health to bosses and mobs alike. So that's the first strength of Bloodless class mod, and the second benefit is that it enables the synergized usage of the newer Nootmad, which gives Moze 150% bonus radiation damage while under 50% health. So why does Bloodless help this annoyance specifically? Well, a lot of what Bloodless does is gives you survivability in a different format, and that is through shield regen, as well as Red Tree having the skill Desperate Measures, which gives you extra gun damage based on how low your health is. Considering to make this Nootmad work, you need to put yourself under 50% health. There's no reason to not pick a skill that will give you gun damage for being under 50% health already. So, combined with that, as well as being able to use a Deathless relic, get 100% gun damage just by being on 1 HP, and that combined with extra elemental damage, just gives Moze a lot of damage. You can also have Phalanx boosted as well. I have a +2 on this class mod, and that also gives me basically 14% gun damage per stack. You're killing a bunch of enemies, you're just going to be ramping up the gun damage, and in no time you'll just be killing mobs like they are nothing. So stemming off from that point I just made, our third point brings us to the amount of gun damage a Bloodless class mod can provide. As I briefly touched on, 6 out of 3 Desperate Measures can give you 100% gun damage, and 7 out of 5, or even 10 out of 5 if you have a Bloodless class mod that boosts Phalanx Doctrine by 5. You get 20% gun damage per stack. That's basically for every enemy kill, you get 20% gun damage. This stacks infinitely as long as you're killing enemies within the 30-second duration of each stack. So, if you're doing something like Slaughter Shaft, if you're doing the raid, if you're doing any sort of area that has a high mob density, the amount of damage you'll be getting from all your Phalanx Doctrine stacks is absolutely ridiculous. Not to mention that the Bloodless can also boost through that thin red line, which gives Moze extra shield based on how low her health is. So if you're boosting this a lot, you can get a really big shield. So yeah, that's the strengths out of the way, and now I'm going to move on to the weaknesses. So our first stop is technically a strength, but also simultaneously a weakness, and that is that Bloodletter only basically provides you with gun damage. So if you watched the previous episode that I made, you would have learned that too much gun damage isn't always a good thing. Nowadays, with enrollments such as consecutive hits, and the gears such as Pearl of Ineffable Knowledge, this gives everyone really accessible damage to the gun damage, and stacked together, once again, you don't want that. Like I mentioned in my previous video, you want to try and get in as many different forms of damage as possible, whether that be through splash annoyance, splash weapons, the Victory Rush relic for example. It's anything like that that you don't want too much gun damage stacked on, and what Bloodletter's selling point is also, once again, its weakness, that it only provides gun damage. Skills such as Desperate Measures, Phalanx Doctrine, only provide you gun damage. They don't provide any form of multiplicative boosts. You don't get splash damage or anything like that. That's something like a Minesweeper class mod or a Blastmaster class mod would give you access to. Rather than that, it's just flat out gun damage. So that's probably one of the weaknesses that I would say. And the second weakness is also that in order to make the most effective use out of the Bloodletter class mod, is that you have to put yourself on low health. Like I mentioned in my strengths section, if you want to put yourself under 50% health, you want to be using skills like Desperate Measures, and to put that, you'll be basically putting yourself under health gate. So in a game where enemies can deal large amounts of damage, and large classes of enemies can burst your health down to nothing despite the amount of health regeneration you have, being able to have access to the safety blanket that is health gate is incredibly important. However, by wanting to use the Bloodletter class mod effectively, you are just putting yourself under that health gate, and you're therefore increasing the chances that you can get one shot by enemies, or go down incredibly quickly after encountering a group of enemies that just deal a ton of damage. So, unless you use mechanics such as the Transformer and Shock self-damage combination, and by that I mean using a shock splash weapon such as the Devil's Foursome Backburner, any weapon that does shock splash damage, combine that with a Transformer, and you're basically filling up your shield as always, because what the Transformer shield does is that it just converts any and all shock damage into your shields. So with a Deathless build, when you have something like 100,000 shield capacity for example, due to the amount of Phalanx stacks you have, due to your Deathless and Thin Red Light combination, Vampire isn't always enough to sustain that high shield number, and you're going to have to resort to using things like shock splash damage and a Transformer to make sure your shield is always up. If you don't do that, you're going to find yourself going down a lot because you don't have health gate, and so that's basically another weakness that the Bloodletter class mod has. So overall, Bloodletter class mod isn't a bad class mod. It has its uses, but just like everything else, it also has its weaknesses. So it's just up to you guys to decide which build it's going to synergize with. If you wanted to use a Bloodletter build, obviously I would suggest speccing into your red tree. Skills like Armored Infantry, Giant and Brass, Experimental Munitions, Desperate Measures, Phalanx Doctrine, and Force Feedback are all really useful skills to have. Tenacious Defense is a bit of a weird skill in the sense that it gives you gun damage based on your shield breaking, but once again, if you are under health gate, once your shield breaks, you're basically dead, so this gun damage buff isn't exactly useful. Oh well, it is in the sense that you still get it even if you go down, but you don't get the shield restoration bonus, so bear that in mind. You don't have shield gate in this game, so if you go down once your shield breaks, you don't get anything out of that. As for the skills, I would sort of consider not picking up currently. I would say Full Cannibal Pass and Behind the Iron Curtain aren't exactly Moze's best skills in this tree, mostly because, once again, if you're using the Bloodletter class mod, you're going to be probably speccing into Vampire to get your shields up, and so skills like these don't really have an impact on the playstyle of a Bloodletter. Skills like Selfless Vengeance is also good. It's kind of gotten to the point where you can decide to pick either Selfless Vengeance or Armored Infantry, whether you decide to just want flat 50% gun damage, or if you decide to have 15% incendiary damage based on the amount of times you reload. If you are running a Bottomless Mags build, obviously I wouldn't spec into Selfless Vengeance, and you just spec into Armored Infantry instead. So yeah, that's about it for the Bloodletter class mod, and now we're just going to move on to the next one, which is Blastmaster. Okay, and we are back. This section of the video, as I mentioned just before, we're going to be covering the Blastmaster class mod. So at this stage of the meta, the Blastmaster class mod has just become synonymous with any and all splash builds, and any Moze player would never leave Sanctuary 3 without one basically. What Blastmaster does is that it gives Moze a ramping splash damage bonus over time, up to 100%. This bonus is incredibly powerful when combined and built correctly within a splash build, and I'm going to quickly go over why. So, as we did with the Bloodless class mod, we'll cover the strengths of the Blastmaster class mod first. Its first strength and most prolific selling point is that it works incredibly well with a splash-based build, especially those that focus on hard-hitting splash weapons such as the Plague Bearer, the Backburner, and Sandhawk, all those sorts of weapons. Any splash damage boosts are welcome for Moze, as in my previous video I discussed why having splash damage is so important. When boosting weapons that already do really high splash damage, like I mentioned before, such as the Backburner and the Plague Bearer, giving them access to an extra 100% splash damage bonus is just absolutely ridiculous, and this enables Moze to do a crazy amount of damage. So, just to quickly touch on the last episode's discussion around short fuse, Blastmaster also synergizes incredibly well with that skill, for the reason that it, alongside any other splash boosts, such as Torque Cross Promotion, splash damage rolls in your gear, splash annulments like the recently buffed 200% splash damage, they basically count twice for short fuse damage, which creates an effect that's essentially known as double dipping. So what does this mean in simple terms? Blastmaster combined the splash rolls and splash annoyance just allowed Moze to deal very high damage through the effective use of splash based weapons. So second to that, and also pretty well related, is that it's an easy access to a damage boost. As long as you don't reload, you get the buff. That's basically all there is to it. There's no finessing, there's no need to jump through hoops, just don't reload, you get the Blastmaster damage bonus. So other class mods, and we'll just take Green Monster for example, require you to constantly shoot to get its ramping damage bonus. Takes about 15 seconds of non-stop firing, and if you want to make a net gain, technically you'd have to fire a gun for 30 seconds straight. There aren't many guns that can do so, and the ones that can do so aren't exactly the most powerful. So that's basically it, and Blastmaster on the other hand is far simpler to maintain. All you have to do is basically put one into redistribution, the class one itself can boost that for you, pick up a few boosts into magazine size, and you're set. You don't have to reload for the majority of guns. So, what's not to love about that? So now, positives aside, it's time to talk about the weaknesses. The first weakness of Blastmaster is that it doesn't synergize well with splash-based weapons. I mean, kinetic weapons though. Now, don't get me wrong, it still does well, as long as short fuse is picked up, which is Moze's Demolition Woman. Capstone. So, when you're using kinetic weapons like the Shredderfire, the Gatling Gun, and the Monarch, so guns that don't have base splash, the Blastmaster class mod doesn't shine at all, which sort of decreases its flexibility and forces you to use a splash-based playstyle if you truly want to maximize its effects. Now, I know a lot of Moze players who aren't exactly a fan of splash-based weapons, they just want to shoot guns like the Monarch, like the Shredderfire, like the Gatling Gun, and I don't blame them. Splash-based playstyle isn't for everyone, and if you want to use the Blastmaster as effective as possible, you're basically locked to using splash-based weapons just to make effective use out of that class mod. So, second to that, even with splash weapons, it requires finesse to work effectively, and outright doesn't provide much benefit to others. So, for example, the Chaos and SMG, which came out with the Mayhem 2.0 update, and is a Mayhem 6 weapon that drops on Captain Traunt on Athenas, I believe. It's a really powerful gun, and works incredibly well. However, with Blastmaster, it's not so great, and I'm going to quickly go over why. So, right off the bat you can see on the item card, it has a relatively small magazine size and a really high fire rate. Even after magazine size boosts and speccing into skills like redistribution, the ammo is hard to maintain in a mag, and so you're forced to reload a lot. What does this mean for Blastmaster? It means that you don't exactly get the always active damage bonus like you would with other guns like the Plague Bearer, like the Backburner, that fires slowly and just deal a lot of splash damage. And second to the Chaosin, the Sandhawk SMG also suffers from the same caveat, in the sense that you need to spec well into Green Tree just to effectively use it. So guns like the Chaosin, like the Sandhawk, you basically need Forge, which is a capstone skill and requires a lot of points to get into, 25 to be exact, and essentially you don't want to be forced, once again, to picking up certain skills just to use a class mod effectively. So this sort of limits Blastmaster's ability to buff the high tier splash based weapons. Unfortunately, the Chaosin and the Sandhawk are that good. They're probably one of the best splash damage weapons in the game currently, and they don't synergize that well with Blastmaster, so you're stuck with using other splash based weapons. Not saying that weapons like the Black Burner and the Plague Bearer are bad, but you're sort of better off using a different class mod like the Mind Super with the Sandhawk and with the Chaosin. So yeah, that's about it I had for Blastmaster, and the next column we're going to go over is the Rocketeer class mod. Okay, so the third column we're going to cover in this video, and the final one, is the Rocketeer class mod. Rocketeer class mod, what it does is that Auto Ban now lasts the rest of the duration that Iron Bear had left if Moze gets out early. This removes any refunding cooldown for exiting early, so it basically just assumes that Iron Bear was used up completely, and it will then last for as long as it was supposed to. I'm going to make a separate video covering Auto Bear and Iron Bear, but I am just waiting for the action skill balancing changes to come out, just in case some information that I might make in a video earlier might get changed. So for the sake of that, I'm just going to wait till the changes happen, and I'll make a video on that as soon as I can. So yeah, Rocketeer class mod basically makes Auto Bear last a very long time. Why is this useful? Primarily, it provides you with a lot of aggro relief, in the sense that all the enemies that would typically be attacking you yourself as Moze would instead attack Iron Bear. Now this isn't always consistent, some enemies do still attack you, but it does help and gives you a bit of relief when you are getting swarmed by mobs. A lot of them do tend to gravitate towards Rocketeer. I have used Rocketeer class mod to raid effect in the Guardian takedown raid during the triple crystal charging phases. You do have to stand still basically, or in a small area, defend it from Guardians. Having Rocketeer and having a long duration Auto Bear basically draws a lot of Guardians to that, so you only have to kill a few to get those objectives done a lot quickly and without as much of a headache. So that's one of the benefits for Rocketeer. The second benefit is that it gives you constant access to one of Moze's sort of best access to multiplicative damage in the form of target softening. What this does is it's an augment for the hardpoint Vanquisher rocket pods, and it basically hits enemies with a target softening rocket pod and helps Moze do 15% extra damage to enemies. This damage boost is multiplicative and is incredibly useful when you're trying to kill enemies that have high amounts of HP. So the Guardians in the Guardian takedown prior to the recent scaling nerfs were really strong in terms of the fact that they had incredibly high amounts of HP. Having target softening always active, it enabled Moze to do a bit more damage and actually helped in a lot of situations. Now I do want to point out that these target softening rockets don't stack, so an enemy will only take 15% extra damage. It doesn't stack no matter how many times they hit. They're not going to take 30% damage, they're not going to take 45% extra damage. It's basically capped out at 15%. But yeah, 2 minutes of that, especially if you're mobbing in something like Slaughter Shaft or in the raid, having access to that sort of damage buff is incredibly useful, and one of the main selling points of Rocket as well. Not to mention it boosts torque cross promotion, so in terms of a splash build, about getting one of Moze's best splash builds, recently buffed to give splash damage, so having a +5 torque cross promotion Rocketeer class mod gives Moze a lot of splash damage that she might not have otherwise. So, as every comm has, they have their downsides. Rocketeer has a few as well. Initially, the long cooldown is a bit of a kicker. Now, it does basically what you see is what you get. You already know that the cooldown is going to be a lot, but if you do plan on using Iron Bear as a form of stress relief, in the fact that you can just jump into Iron Bear if you start getting swarmed by enemies, if you start to take a lot of damage and you need a quick form of healing, you just jump into Iron Bear, let your shields recharge, jump back out, and you're good to go. That sort of playstyle doesn't synergize well with Rocketeer, and if Auto Bear was to die almost immediately after you exiting it, you basically don't have Iron Bear for 2 minutes, unless you spec the skills like Grizzled, unless you're getting a lot of kills, unless you have cooldown reduction stats on your class mod or your artifact, you're going to have a tough time not having Iron Bear up. So that's one of the downsides. And the second downside is that having this long cooldown, it impacts Moze's ability to access the action skill and anointments. So whether that be the splash damage anointments, whether it be the next 2 mag anointments, whether it be the 100% damage anointment, any anointments that's based on action skill end, requires Moze to jump in and exit Iron Bear. With a Rocketeer class mod, you're basically excluded from that sort of playstyle because the long cooldown sort of invalidates the benefits you will get from 10 or 15 seconds of extra damage, which most of those anointments provide. So yeah, that's my take on the Rocketeer class mod, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next part of the video. Okay, so that's about it for the video I made tonight. I hope you guys found it informative. If you have suggestions for things you would like me to cover in a follow-up video, please let me know in the comment section below. Aside from that, thank you guys so much for watching and for all the support you've given me over my previous videos. I hope you guys find this guide useful, and I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya!